On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we sit down with the anti-prostitution activist, Rachel Moran.
What prostitution is compensated sexual assault. It's the commercialization of sexual abuse.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not. Socialism, obedience, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. The reduction of another human being to an object, and the glorification of male power and violence, whether in war or prostitution, are romanticized by popular culture. It is difficult to challenge the lies disseminated about sex work or about military virtues. Those who counter the dominant narrative, even if they speak from long personal experience, are drowned out. Speaking the truth about war or the truth about prostitution is lonely and often futile. The manufactured illusion of heroes or glamorous call girls plays to a culture that celebrates the commodification of human beings. Those who have escaped the clutches of prostitution or war, often struggling to cope with trauma, guilt, and shame, are reticent to resurrect in public the nightmare that will hound them for the rest of their lives. Being prostituted is not work. It is being raped for a living. RT correspondent Anya Parampil looks at the movement to decriminalize the activity of prostituted women and criminalize the work of traffickers, pimps, and johns.
The horrific business of human trafficking is the world's fastest growing crime, as it generates an estimated $32 billion annually. The UN estimates 79% of trafficked women are trafficked for sexual exploitation. But there is one way of regulating prostitution which proponents say reduces its demand and protects vulnerable women. It's known as the Nordic model, and it's based on the premise that prostitution is actually a form of male violence against women. It characterizes sex workers as victims rather than criminals, and it's been growing in Europe, implemented in countries like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. Its strictest form can be found in Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, which have all unilaterally banned the purchase of sex, period. And according to Stockholm University, it has reduced the amount of prostitutes in Sweden from around 3,000 in 1993 to about 300 in 2008. However, the laws do have their critics who say they're based on the moral position that the sale of sex in any case is wrong. And we should acknowledge instead that prostitution is one of humankind's oldest professions and thus nearly impossible to outlaw. Rather, countries like Spain and the Netherlands have sought to protect sex workers by decriminalizing the industry and regulating it. One thing is agreed upon, however: sex workers are some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the world, and it should be the goal of us all to protect them.
Today I'm joined by the anti-prostitution activist, Rachel Moran. She was a prostituted woman in Ireland for 7 years and has done in her book, Paid For, My Journey Through Prostitution, what I attempted to do in my book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, about the reality of war. She has endured very similar attacks from people who prefer the myth to the reality. This myth has seduced many on the left with the absurd idea that being prostituted is a form of work, rather than a raw, brutal, and soul-destroying form of capitalist exploitation. Rachel,
Hello.
Let's talk about the idea of choice. This is used by people who argue that sex work should be legalized.
Well, of course they need to use that argument, because if you strip that argument out of the frame, you're left with the raw, ugly reality. And people who want to excuse prostitution, of course, don't want to look at that, and they don't want anyone else looking at it. So, of course, they have to bring in this element of choice. Now, the reality that I know is that prostitution is something that happens in the lives of individuals in the absence of choice, and because they had no choice. So that argument...
And you yourself entered prostitution when you became homeless.
Yeah, I left home at 14 due to very extreme dysfunction in my environment, and was homeless pretty much straight away and was prostituted within a year. So for me...
By your boyfriend?
Well, when I say I was prostituted, I was prostituted, I mean by wide variety of men. But I was pimped into it initially by a young man I met, yeah.
And would you say among the women that you worked with, that was the norm?
We were there because we had no choice.
Right.
Simple as. I never met a woman in prostitution who was there because she wanted to be there.
Let's talk about the concept of prostitution as work.
Well, you know, that's the one that's, the whole phrase sex work was invented in order to try to frame prostitution as simply a matter of labour. Of course it isn't. What prostitution is compensated sexual assault. It's the commercialization of sexual abuse. I've said this many times. And, you know, you opened the show by identifying prostitution as really the heart and soul of capitalism, I suppose, the deepest part of it, and that's exactly what it is.
What are, if we look at prostitution as a form of labor, what are actually the skills and attributes that you need to be a prostituted woman?
Well, I've identified them from my own experience as the ability to restrain the urge to cry, the ability to restrain the urge to vomit, and such things that absolutely are counter to human nature. Because when you're dreadfully upset, of course you want to cry. When you're extremely nauseated, of course you want to vomit, and so forth. And another really big and very important skill is the ability to imagine yourself out of your current reality, to pretend that this is not happening. That's very important, which of course leads to dissociation. So these are the things that it's necessary to be able to cultivate within the self in order to get the so-called job or work.
And what are the consequences of that?
Oh, enormous psychological and emotional trauma, lifelong. And by that I mean I'm not curled up in a ball crying every night, Chris, but I do know that that has affected my life and always will, and I can say the same of every woman I organise with now politically who's been through the sex trade.
And talk about how that trauma manifests itself.
Oh, there are so many ways. For a lot of women it's very connected to relationships. Sometimes it's connected to the ability to have a romantic connection itself. Then other times it might affect sexuality. That's very common. For me, I think it's removed me from myself in a sense that I'm not sure I will ever 100% be able to forge that broken link, if you like.
To what extent is the sexual abuse of children a precursor to prostitution, a kind of conditioning for prostitution?
It's been described as boot camp for prostitution. I believe it was the feminist activist Andrea Dworkin who made that remark. I think she's absolutely right. Luckily for me, in my childhood, although I did have several approaches from paedophiles, I was never ritualistically, ongoingly sexually abused, but I know many, many women who were. It's huge as a precursor.
From the 7 years that you were engaged in this activity, I think you break down the types of Johns, the types of clients you had into 3 categories. What are they?
I would say that if you were to roughly break them down, you have men who get off on the situation, on your powerlessness in the situation. Now those are the toughest men you'll ever have to deal with in prostitution.
We should add that you started when you were 15.
As a minor, yeah.
And you write in your book, Paid For, that you would always make sure and tell the Johns that you were 15 because they got off faster.
Oh yeah, they did, and that became apparent to me on my very first day. So what I figured out at the time was a very kind of crude kind of way of trying to protect myself. I knew that this excited them enormously, so I'd make sure that they knew about it, and that would get me out of the car quicker, and so that was kind of a defense mechanism. It was in the years since, thinking about it and analysing it in my own mind, that I really realised that the core of prostitution is about despoilment. That's what it's really about. It's about using the body of another person when you know damn fine and well
even
that
a child.
Oh yes, yeah. And look, I operated the phones in indoor prostitution for years after we were all run off the streets in '93. And I think I said to you the last time we spoke, Chris, I would be relentlessly confronted with the question, what age is the youngest girl you've got, and all sorts of variations on that theme. So it was, yeah, it's about despoilment. The idea that
for all, and we'll go back to this, but for all three of the different types of sort of categories that you confronted in prostitution, you would say it's for all of them it's about despoilment?
I think that for some men they have this, you see, the myths of prostitution are so pervasive that there actually are men out there who find it very easy not to look at the reality of prostitution, even when they're in a brothel, you know. But I don't believe for a moment that the majority of men are not aware of what it is.
Well, I think you broke it down into those who have a kind of sadistic impulse,
yeah,
to those who are just numb, and to those who will verbally recognize the humanity of the woman and yet carry out sexual activity which denies their humanity. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, look, very recently there's been a new project put together by abolitionist colleagues of mine in France. So this is a virtual brothel, a website. All of the women in it are women who are deceased and or badly injured at this time. So the men are calling this brothel that doesn't actually exist. And the attitudes are remarkable, they're very striking. Some of the men are very embarrassed, some of them are hanging up the phone, others are joking and saying, oh, well, if she's in hospital, surely she has a friend who could step in for her. Wow. Some of the men are completely unmoved by the fact that these women are, most of them, in graveyards. It's absolutely ridiculous to try to frame this human rights violation as work.
Well, and we should say that early death is one of the characteristics of being prostituted.
Absolutely it is. The homicide rate has been recorded at as high as 40 times the national average. Suicide has been found to be a significant consequence of prostitution. And what we never get into looking at is all of the other ways that women die. And there are many of them.
Great, thank you. When we come back, we'll hear more from Rachel Moran, author of Paid For, My Journey Through Prostitution.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded and you'll get the straight talk and the straight news. Question more.
I'm Tom Hartman, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture.
There's been no charges filed.
And when you question more, you find what you're looking for.
This is the legislative branch of the parliament.
We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? What's your biggest fear in life? Ever been on a hayride? When's the last time you read a book? What would you say if you ever met the Pope? Who's the best quarterback of all time? What's one topping that doesn't belong on a pizza? Now, I've interviewed you too. Question more.
You're watching an RT America special report.
Man, it ain't about him. It's about you. It's about me. It's about everybody.
Basically, everything that you think you know about civil society had broken down.
There's always going to be somebody else one step ahead of the game.
We should not be in the business of normalizing violence.
We don't need people that think like this on our planet. This is an incredibly tense situation.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. We'll continue our conversation with Rachel Moran, author of Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution. There's a myth perpetuated by movies like Pretty Woman that there is a level of prostitution, the high-class call girl who goes to the five-star hotel, that is somehow glamorous, different from being on the street.
There is, and it's laughable. I made the remark in Paid For, I believe, that the nature of your surroundings doesn't change anything to do with the actual act, and that it makes no difference at the end of the day whether your arse is rubbing against white linen sheets or rough and concrete. And that was really my way of crystallizing the understanding that it just does not matter whether you're in a five-star hotel or whether you're in the back of a car or whatever, because this situation involves bodily invasion, and that can happen anywhere, and luxurious surroundings do nothing to change that.
Well, you write in the book that you actually prefer to be on the street.
Oh yeah, very
Why?
much so. Well, I've always said if I had to do one night in prostitution again, and it was absolutely necessary for some, you know, unimaginable reason, I would hit the street every single time. There's no doubt about it.
Why?
Because you have a very, you have no autonomy whatsoever in most circumstances, but on the street at least.
You mean in a hotel?
Yes.
And I think you also write in the book that the possibility of violence increases in a hotel room.
Yeah, and studies have shown that, and that doesn't surprise me at all. There is this myth that the street is the worst, most dangerous place you can possibly be. Now, if you're on street and you're under heavily violent pimp control, that of course will change the nature of the situation. But when I was on the street, I was able to say to myself, I don't like the look in his eyes, I'm not going to take the risk tonight. But if you're on the other end of a phone line, you can't assess a man down a phone line. You turn up at the hotel or at his apartment or wherever, and the door closes behind you, and you're in a much more dangerous situation.
Well, you talk in the book about how you actually preferred to deal with clients who were into fetishes.
Oh yeah, they were just simply much easier. Yeah, they were
Why?
much easier to deal with. Well, primarily because they're not looking to penetrate your body.
Huh.
In most cases, especially if a man is into this submissive carry-on, or if he's a transvestite, it runs counter-current to his fantasy.
I see.
You know, so that made them very much easier anyway to deal with.
What is behind the whole movement to legalize quote-unquote sex work?
You know, the last time we met and spoke, Chris, I hadn't at that time been to New Zealand. I've been there since. So I have seen exactly the model now with my own eyes.
Where prostitution is legal, like Germany.
Yeah, well, the situation there is that pimping and brothel keeping and every peripheral activity you can imagine related to the running of the sex trade is decriminalized, which is simply legalization by a different name. Now, what I saw on the streets of New Zealand, I will never forget as long as I live. The first night I went down there, we saw, myself and a colleague of mine, a woman prostituting from the side of the road in her Zimmer frame, right? Now, I never seen that anywhere in the world, and I've been through over 20 countries now researching prostitution.
A Zimmer frame?
A Zimmer, you know those, do they use the same term here?
Like a walker?
Yes, yeah. A woman who could barely stand. She needed the use of a walker to stand up at the side of the road. And in the 5 or 10 minutes after we begun speaking to her, a young woman, many years younger than her, came running up, screaming, crying. She'd just been raped and robbed in a car moments before. The outreach workers who showed us around and spoke to us explained that they have been doing their work now for more than 15 years, so from before decriminalization came in. And what they said to us was that they used to be dealing with in the range of 6 to 8 women out on those streets. Now they're dealing with somewhere in the region of 50 to 60. So that is what's happened in the 12, 13 years since decriminalization came into New Zealand. The trade has expanded enormously, as it always does.
And what are the forces that you think are behind this drive to legalize prostitution?
Well, we know that pimps are playing a massive role in this behind the scenes. We've seen Alexandra Gill, who inputted, by the way, into the Amnesty International consultation.
And we should be clear that Amnesty International has called for
They have called for the New Zealand model, yes.
Right.
Yeah. And we know that some of the people who gave their views into the Amnesty consultation about the future framing of prostitution legislation, some of them are pimps. One of them in particular, Alejandra Gil, who I just mentioned, is serving 15 years in a Mexican prison. So I think Amnesty really need to take a good long look at who they're listening to.
But they've shut voices like yours out.
Oh, absolutely. Amnesty have refused to debate with me on 2 occasions now. One last year in London, and the second time just in recent weeks in front of the New York bar.
And what was their reason for that?
But they didn't give a reason. They just heard my name and goodbye.
You're also attacked quite a bit.
Relentlessly.
What's the nature of those attacks?
Well, it's absolutely never ending on social media. In my own personal life, I've had to have my house put on the pulse system, which means that if a call comes in from my address, the rapid response unit of the police will arrive. I've had no end. I've been stalked for years by one very, very unwell individual.
And when they attack you, what do they say? How do they attack you?
Generally, they'll say that I'm a liar, a fraudster, that I was never in prostitution in my life. This has been repeated in so many circles, just unbelievable.
Well, where do you think that comes from?
I think it comes from a place of ignorance and fear in a lot of cases, and I think it comes from maliciousness and nastiness in others. I think
fear. What do you mean fear? Like fear
I think there are people out there who are simply afraid to hear what I have to say and to give it credence because it runs so directly counter to their ideology, which they are so committed to.
Why do you think the left has bought into this idea of sex work? I mean, they will decry the exploitation of women in sweatshops in Bangladesh, and yet they say nothing about sexual exploitation. They seek to legitimize it. Well, why is that?
Because we're living in a patriarchy, quite frankly, and if there's any one group of people who can be thrown under the bus in a patriarchy, it's women. And we know that females, that women and girls make up the vast majority of the prostituted population of this earth. It's absolutely sickening that the left, the level of, just the level of, I can't even find the word I'm looking for, it's so shocking. It runs absolutely counter to every principle on the left.
But it's so unfeeling. I mean, there's just no capacity for empathy.
That's huge, and I mean, what I have found most astonishing is the way that voices from the left will confront me, knowing that I was a homeless 15-year-old girl.
Wouldn't you say that the left is your primary opponent?
You would have thought so. You certainly would have hoped so. But that
No, I meant, but in fact, the left, it's the left that goes after you with the most venom, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And I misunderstood what you were about to say there. I thought you were about to say, wouldn't you have thought that they would have been your strongest ally?
Right.
You would have, but it's quite the opposite.
And when you confront these figures, what is usually their response to you? What is their answer? What is the kind of cliche that they throw back at you?
It's some nonsense about my individual experience not being reason enough, I suppose, to even look at this issue as a matter of exploitation. They would rather listen to the 0.01% of upper middle class white Western women who are prostituting their way through with their PhD degrees and such almost unheard of fantasy situations. Those women are by no means representative. Everybody knows it. And it's being ignored by the left, who really, I feel, ought to take themselves for a walk through the streets of Songnagachi or any of the many places.
Well, maybe they could try it out for a night.
Yeah, or even an hour, one booking.
Right. You had told me earlier that one of the ways to expose that this is not work is that as you age out of prostitution, you are just cast aside.
Well, I mean, if we look at the different ways that, this nonsense terminology, for example, the oldest profession. If we look at any other profession on the earth, you've got to have qualifications, right, in order to even begin. Prostitution is constantly pushed at us as a form of labor sort of work or profession. But nothing about the way that it operates mirrors any actual profession anywhere, either in how you get into it, or what happens during it, or what happens as you leave it. It's unimaginable to think of any other so-called profession where you'd go in with absolutely no training or no experience, and in fact the less training and experience you have, the more beneficial to you. So it operates in quite the opposite way, and yet we're expected to accept it as a profession. It's not a profession, it's not work. And we can call it sex work until the sky falls in and we all catch larks. It's not work.
Well, and as you pointed out, after 20 or 30 years, unlike another job,
Yeah, and you won't have any remuneration at the far end of it either. There's no pension. There's no sense of this person has 30 years experience, you know. There's some worth in that. The more experience you have in prostitution, the less worth you have. So again, it's just another example of prostitution operating quite counter to any other form of profession.
Well, and we've seen that. Where they have legalized prostitution, the argument has been that these people can register as workers, but they don't register.
They don't. Absolutely not. And 400,000 women in Germany, 44 have registered.
Wow.
So.
And it becomes industrial.
It does, absolutely. And, you know, we cannot say for a million reasons that prostitution is work.
Great. Thank you, Rachel.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for joining me. That was Rachel Moran, author of Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution. The war industry, like the prostitution industry, feeds off of the despair, poverty, and hopelessness that afflict the lives of many of the young. In a world of closed doors and few opportunities, the military, like prostitution, appears to offer a way out. Military recruiters, after all, are little more than uniformed human traffickers. All traffickers of human beings target the vulnerable and the poor. They make promises that are usually never kept. They promise an income to the desperate. Once they have their prey trapped, they force them into a life that bears little resemblance to the fantasy they peddled. Prostituted girls and women, nearly all from the developing world or the impoverished pockets within our own society, are the quintessential expression of our callous neoliberal order. They are stripped of their humanity to become commodities, which in the end is how corporate power looks at all of us. Thank you for joining us. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.